Harry Duran, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Danielle, for having me on. I really appreciate the opportunity to share my story with your audience.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, Harry, you've been in podcasting for a long time and you're well recognized as a voice of authority in the podcasting industry. But how did you actually get started in this weird game?
If I go far back enough, it started with my passion for house music.
Ah,
I grew up in when I was in high school, just admiring like friends that were DJs, and then learned. I bought turntables, so I learned how to DJ on vinyl with turntables, and it's always been a passion of mine. Like before podcasting, my passion has always been electronic music, specifically house music, which is not EDM, but that's a separate discussion. I won't go down that rabbit hole. But in probably, I'm trying to figure out when this might have been, but I was working my corporate job, and I had dabbled in a couple of entrepreneurial things here and there, but I was working on a mobile app. It's called Know Your DJ, and this is probably 2012, and it was like Pandora, but just for electronic music, so just DJs. And my friend helped me build the app. In order to promote it, I thought I'd start a podcast. So I went to New Media Expo in Las Vegas in 2014, and the three tracks were blogging, podcasting, and YouTube. And I had the intention of creating a podcast to interview DJs, and then I quickly realized how hard that was going to be to interview globe-trotting DJs. And I noticed the podcasters that were there, Pat Flynn, Amy Porterfield, some people might recognize those names. And I thought this was interesting. What about if I tell the story of these podcasters? And a show that I used to watch, I used to be fans of here in the States, is called Inside the Actor Studio. And it's James Lipton is the host. And I did a little bit of acting in New York. I studied acting. I didn't do any acting. I just studied acting. So that's why I used to watch that show. But what was fascinating is that he would tell those stories or just sit down with an hour with an actor. And normally it's someone you'd see on screen, you know nothing about them. But after an hour, you got to know a little bit about them, just a little bit about things that interest them. And so I thought, what about that for podcasting? And then that's how the name was born. I remember someone speaking about at that conference saying, "Oh, who here is a podcast junkie?" And I had like I think 20 podcasts on my phone at the time because I just got sucked into that world. And so I came back. I signed up for John Lee Dumas's Podcasters Paradise, and I told him I was starting the show, and everyone supported me in getting that off the ground. And I just started thinking about who I had known or met. I met a couple of people at the conference. I asked Chase Reeves to be my first guest, and just little by little, just started stair stepping my way to just get more names known. And I did video to begin with. So we didn't have the tools that we have back then, like Riverside and Squadcast. But back then I was using a Skype with call recorder so I could capture the audio, but I could see the video. What was important for me, Danielle, from day one is to have that face-to-face connection with my guest. And then I started just having these conversations. In the beginning, like everyone else, I had my list of questions, but very quickly, after about episode 6 or 7, I found it was just more natural to have a conversation and just talk about what was on their minds. And a lot of times, the podcast was the starting point, but we would just get off into these random topics about things that are passionate about, hobbies. You know, it was just the podcast being the common ground to bring us together for the conversation. But then I just let it go where it went, and I would just pull threads that interested me and just have really fascinating conversations. So it's been 8+ years, closing in on 300 episodes.
wow. And look, that's really brave too to go, okay, all questions kind of out the door. Like to do that at, what was it, 6 or 7 episodes and just to go with the flow, that would have been a huge, leap of faith. Um, to really listen to the conversation and just really engage, which is really
Yeah,
powerful.
it's not something that immediately came naturally. I think the episode was actually John Lee Dumas. I think he's known for just having really 30 long, short 30-minute interviews because he batches his interviews. I think at one point he said he did all 30 interviews for the month in 2 days because he comes from a military background and is really disciplined, and he would just hammer through these. So I think it was a midday interview, and I didn't have a lot of time. And I said, I'm not going to take, just I'm just going to ask him what's going on. It's just a short interview, so I'm just going to say, hey, how you doing? How's it going? And I just felt much more relaxed. And I grew up in the era of like my parents making me watch 60 Minutes and 2020 and these talk shows and Barbara Walters and these other interviewers. And I've come to appreciate the skill that's required to hold a long form conversation. I love Joe Rogan. I love the fact that he can have a 3 hour long conversation with people on a variety of topics. And I think it's an acquired skill. It's something you get better at over time. But a lot of times, Danielle, it's just a function of being genuinely interested in the person, in what they have to say, and then giving them the space to tell their story, and then listening intently for threads you can pull or things that are interesting for you. Because if they're interesting for you as the listener, you're a proxy for your listener. And so I always tell people there's three people in a podcast conversation: the host, the guest, and the listener. And that's listener singular. There's one person listening at a time. You're not on stage. A lot of times public speakers, they come into a podcast or they start a podcast and they're like, hey everyone, like they're on stage. And just as an example, we're on video, so you can see, like, the intimacy. Like if I move the mic and if I move the mic back closer to my mouth, like you can notice like the intimacy. People are listening to podcasts on earbuds, and so you're having that one-to-one communication with them. And I want them to feel as if we were in a bar talking and they just pulled up a stool and just listening to us have this conversation. And just always, I'm always aware of continuing to maintain and build that intimacy.
Absolutely. And look, you've done such a great job, both Podcast Junkies and then your other podcast, which is vertical farming as well, which is such a different topic. How did you stumble along that one?
So I was doing Podcast Junkies for a year, and then I hired a business coach. Shout out to Taki Moore. He runs a program called Black Belt.
I know
Really
Taki,
good guy.
yep.
Yeah, really good guy. And I learned a lot about digital marketing that I didn't know, because they don't teach you this stuff in corporate or in university. And I was just growing my skills as a podcaster, and all that stuff I did for Podcast Junkies. I literally did everything. I scheduled the interview, had the conversation, edited the audio, wrote the show notes, did the social media, did the graphics, and I did that for a year. And then that's how FullCast, my agency, was born, because I realized, being in Taki's program, people were paying him a premium on a monthly basis to be in that mastermind. And I was like, wow, these people, they're having success because they understand opportunity cost, like what an hour of their time is worth. And I was like, what if I packaged everything I know about podcasting? And because I come from an operations background, I like, writing SOPs and documenting everything. So I was able to just package it in a way where it was valuable to those folks. And some of my earliest clients came from Black Belt. And it was interesting that sort of like off and running. And so I was doing that. We've now produced shows for over 100 clients. But in 2020, probably late 2019, one of my existing clients, he gave me a book called Abundance by Peter Diamandis. And I'm always about future technologies. I got the shiny object syndrome when it comes to like new tools and new apps. My partner's like, please don't send me another link for some app to test or something, because she realizes that I love testing out all these new things. And it was a mention of vertical farming, and I had heard a bit of a reference to it, and I was like, this is interesting. So I read a book called The Future is Vertical Farming by a professor, Columbia professor named Dixon Despommier. It was a short read, and I was like, this is interesting. So I started thinking. I have a marketing sort of background, and so my brain is always thinking about new ideas, new business ideas. And I said, what if I created my own podcast client? I know how to do the interviews. We've had, at that point now, 6+ years of experience, long form interviews. We know how to produce a quality show, because that's what we do at the agency. So put those together. And then strategically, Danielle, I was looking at an industry that was getting a lot of funding and is growing. Vertical farming, I think at the time it was like $14 billion in investments coming in by 2026 was the projection. So in my mind, VC money, investment money, equals marketing dollars, equals dollars that can be spent to sponsor a podcast. So I said, what kind of podcast would a sponsor be interested in putting their money behind? Well, what if I called it exactly what it is, the Vertical Farming Podcast? And this is something a lot of times new podcasters, they get in their head about creating like, a fun name that has maybe not a lot to do, like the two marketing gals in the basement. Like, nobody's searching for that term.
Yeah.
So I said, it's called it's about vertical farming. It's a podcast. So I thankfully the domain was available, verticalfarmingpodcast.com. If you Google those three words, it's literally the first thing that shows up in the Google search. And I basically reverse engineered a vehicle that would be attractive to sponsors. And then I grabbed all the socials, so Vertical Farm Pod on Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, Instagram. And then I started just doing my research into the industry. And then I said, I'm going to only interview founders and CEOs because I was thinking, how do I make a high visibility podcast? Well, that's if the who's who of the industry is who I'm speaking to. And so that's how I started. I started with some early folks who run websites about vertical farming and then stair stepped my way. And I said, hey, I'm going to interview like these people. So I hadn't interviewed them, but I scheduled to reach out to them. And then when I would get one of them scheduled and recorded, I would change the language. And I said, well, I just interviewed this person and I'm about to interview these. And so just slowly but surely, people started, giving me the opportunity to have those early conversations. And now I'm, 50 plus interviews in. It's been 5 seasons. We're just wrapping up season 5 and I've had a sponsor for every season. During COVID is when the actual podcast kicked off, so it was early 2020. And I remember asking one of my early guests, we're looking for sponsorships for the podcast. He's like, speak to my marketing guy. I spoke to the marketing person. I said, how much are you paying at these conferences for a booth for these conferences that you can't go to anymore? And he said, well, about $20,000 US. And I said, well, what about if you just sponsor my podcast specifically dedicated to the vertical farming industry and, for half that price, just, I think it came in a little bit lower. Mind you, Danielle, I hadn't even released an episode. And he said, yeah, let's do it. And so my first sponsor came on board. Shout out to IGS, Intelligent Growth Solutions. And ever since then, I've had a sponsor for every season. My latest sponsor, Cultivated, they were a season 4 sponsor. And when it came time to renew at a higher price point, he said, by all means, not only do we want season 5, we also want season 6. We're not letting this go. We literally have people coming to us and saying, we heard you on the podcast. And that's what you need to hear as a podcaster. And so it's been fascinating. I've been to two indoor farming conferences this year, Indoor AgCon and Indoor AgTech NYC. And I came back from the most recent one with another 20 interviews. I have companies that were at the conference asking me if I want to partner on producing other shows in the industry. I've had someone subsequently reach out to me who's creating an app for gardening and he wants me to advise him. So it's been amazing what's happened in the span of 2 years. And it's just a testament to how much thought leadership you can build up in a space as a podcaster if you're really focused and intentional about what you're creating.
It's pretty amazing because you went into that then, I'm assuming, like not as a vertical farming expert, just as someone who is genuinely curious. And I often see podcasters, like particularly when they're quite new in the podcasting world, really reluctant to get certain guests on because they feel like they don't know enough about the topic themselves. So I love that in that, you got a sponsorship for a podcast that in an industry that you weren't known in, but you backed yourself in terms of your podcasting ability. That's really impressive.
And I think what was important is telling the story. So I demonstrated, when I would do this outreach, I said, I've been doing this for a while. I've been podcasting since 2014. So that's my pedigree. Like I know what I'm doing. I know long form interviews. I've done almost, it was like 270 interviews by that time. I own an agency. We've been running the agency since 2015. So it's not like I just came in out of the blue. And then I said, so it was clear that I was going to be taking this seriously. And what I tell people is that I'm learning at the same time my listeners are learning. And I focused on what I knew best, how to tell origin stories, how to have people open up and tell me their background, what got them into, vertical farming, whether they're a CEO or not. It's a lot of times that I wasn't phased by who they were because I wasn't in the industry. So I wasn't going to have like starry eyes that I was speaking to the CEO of this company. It's just another person. And, what COVID, one of the benefits of it, the few benefits was that it leveled the playing field, and everyone was, we all felt like we were all in this together. And it was just a special moment and just a reminder that we're all humans living a human experience and we all have stories to tell. And I was just curious to hear what, what their path, what their journey in life, how that led them to where they are now as the head of this company. And it's been, a really fantastic experience. And a lot of times I'll have them say at the end of the interview, wow, this went by so fast. I just felt so comfortable, or you made me feel at ease, or I just can't believe I shared that story about the village I grew up in. I've never told anyone publicly that story before. And so that's when you're creating a safe space for your guest. And your whole intention during that conversation is to ensure that your audience, gets to hear their story.
It's a really good point because, as you said, like these are CEO of companies, but they may not necessarily be experienced or well versed in podcasting. So you mentioned about like making them really comfortable. Do you have like little tips or things, rituals that you do to help make your guests feel more comfortable before they come into the show and during it?
Yes, there's a couple of sort of mantras that I live by. The first one came as a result of doing Podcast Junkies for so long. I said treat your guests like gold, and I always think about this entire cycle of contact that a guest has with you. A really good book that I like to recommend to people is Never Lose a Customer Again by Joey Coleman. What was fascinating about that book when someone gave it to me is he paints this journey of like a client, and it starts with them engaging with you and you don't even know they exist. They've seen your name mentioned somewhere, they've seen your socials, they've come to your website, they've downloaded one of your lead magnets, they've signed up for your email list, they're engaging with you or your content, and you don't know, they're not on your radar yet, but all this while they're getting a feel for who you are as a person. What do you talk about? What do you value? Like, do you have a professional looking website? And so by the time they start to engage with you, then they've already started that journey. You're just getting started with them. So what's your interaction with them? What's your first contact point with them? What's your first email? What's that email sequence look like? What's the first time you get on the phone with them? Are you on time? Just all these little things, up to the point, from a client perspective, you have the conversation with them. What's the proposal look like? The understanding that when people immediately commit to paying for something, they get buyer's remorse. So how are you handling that period? Because they get really nervous about exchanging that large sum of money. So I've always loved the way that Joey laid it out in the book. And I thought of that from a guest perspective. Like when guests engage with your podcast, are you conscious of the fact that they may have heard of your show before, they've seen your artwork before, or they've seen you mentioned on another show, or they heard about you on the podcast? So just, when by the time they get in my world and I invite them, I want to make sure that the onboarding process, the invitation process is clean. Is it something like a Calendly or a SavvyCal that makes booking easy? At the time of the booking, are you asking them for the pertinent information, like what's their headshot, what's all their socials, because we want to tag them later on. So we want to make sure Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, Instagram. Is there something you're working on? Is there a book you're working on? Like I asked that at the time they're booking, because I've had this is just a learned experience because I made the mistakes early on. Like you post the wrong photo of a guest, or like don't use that photo. I haven't used that photo in like 3 years because you tracked it down on the internet somehow. So I always want to make sure, again, treat your guests like gold, and just make sure they have a fantastic experience throughout the life cycle of like their engagement with you. When it comes time to getting ready for the interview, we send them a whole sheet, a prep sheet that says this is the experience you can expect. We're going to be using a tool called Squadcast. Have some water handy because you'd be surprised how dry your mouth gets when speaking for over an hour. If you feel the need to do a second take, that's fine. Is there anything else you want to talk about? Be in a quiet environment, have headphones, like all these little things that over the years you realize make for a really good experience. And then similar to the experience I had coming on this show, just a reminder, hey, this is not live. If you feel the need to do a second take on anything, by all means, go ahead. We can fix this up in post production. If you feel the need to take a break as well, take a drink of water, by all means, we want you to feel as comfortable as possible. And then, at the end, just make sure you're focused with them and making sure that they're having a great experience. And then at the end of the conversation, obviously thank them. And then once that's done, that engagement with your guest is not over, because once the episode is published, then we create a whole sheet. We said, hey, Danielle, thank you for coming on the show. These are some of the marketing materials we've created for the show. Here's some audiograms. Here's some artwork. Here's some graphics we created. Here's some copy you can use in your socials. Here's a click to tweet. You can just one click tweet. It'll open up in Twitter. Here's the embed code for the podcast player. Like everything we can think of to give them in one sheet. We use a tool called Notion that lets you embed this in one page. And you'd be surprised how many times, Danielle, like they get this, and then I see the copy that I wrote on social because I'm like, oh, they used it, cool. Because again, you never want your guest working harder to promote your episode than you, because they've already done you the favor of being on the show. We've all been there. We've been on podcasts and people say, hey, Harry, your episode is live, can you promote it? And that's the email, like literally no attachments, no nothing. I'm like, thanks. Where do I even go? And people's got have so much on their plates nowadays. Like, why am I going to stress out my guest even more? I just want that experience to be so seamless. And, I really think about that entire life cycle of the experience guests have on my show.
And that's such a good point around just making it as seamless as possible, because they are time poor, and also too they're more likely to recommend, hey, maybe you should get this person on as another guest, and refer other people as well, and it just opens that door to their networks of people as well, and help to grow your reach. So it's such an important part, but often so overlooked from a podcasting perspective. So
And it doesn't take much more work, Danielle, to do that. And this is something that's, sometimes I get a little frustrated when I see podcasters who don't go. You don't have to go that extra mile, that much further than what you're already doing. It's just enhancing the process. And that makes it good for the whole podcasting industry. Like, if we all had quality interviews and if we all had quality experiences, there's always new people coming to the space who are on their first podcast interview. And if they have like a really crappy experience, like, that's going to color them, like, oh yeah, I was on a podcast once, amateur hour. Those guys don't know what they're doing. We all are ambassadors for the podcasting industry. Anyone who's a podcast host, anyone who's also a podcast guest, they're starting to play their part as well. But we all have a role to play in growing this industry, whether we realize it or not. So just doing those little extra things, and then I've transferred that over to vertical farming, and now the mantra is treat your sponsors like gold, because I'm always bending over backwards because of those relationships that I have with those sponsors. And every chance I get to mention them, I mention my sponsors on this show, for for my other shows, because Focusrite sponsors me on Podcast Junkies. Cultivated is my sponsor of vertical farming. And I'm always, anytime I have a platform, anytime I have a stage, I'm mentioning my sponsors, even on shows where there's probably no one listening about that topic, because I'm conscious of just, you never know who's listening. You never know who's listening. And I want to remind, and when we promote shows for vertical farming, I tag them in socials. I mention them in the show notes, anything that's possible. When we sign up a new sponsor for new season, I do a big post on my LinkedIn. So I use all the platforms I have at my availability to get the word out, because I treasure that relationship as well. And as most podcasters know, like, once you have a relationship with a sponsor, it's so much easier to maintain it, as opposed to trying to go out and look for a new one when the contract's up.
Which is a real good point. Like, where would someone who is looking for a sponsor, do you have any tips for them as to where to start to look initially, just to start to get that foot in the door, and how do you start to price it?
It's really interesting because there's there's two models for sponsorship. The main ones, the one that most people are familiar with, is the CPM model, and the M is Roman numeral N. It comes from, like, the marketing, digital marketing world. So it's essentially cost per thousand, and right now the going rate is $25 US. So for every 1,000 downloads you get on your podcast episode, you would be compensated $25 by a sponsor. A lot of times you're working with an agency, so they're going to take their cut, but let's assume you get the $25. So you'd have to get, let's say your show is going gangbusters and you're getting 10,000 downloads an episode, which is extremely hard, by the way, and I'll circle back to why that is in a second. But 10,000 downloads means 10 times the 1,000, so you're getting 10 times the $25. So that's $250 per episode. And let's say you're doing a weekly show, you're getting $1,000 a month for your podcast. I don't know about you, but I don't know that many podcasters would be able to just have that as their only source of income. And it's very challenging to have that model. It's a model that works once you start scaling up to the 50,000, 100,000, the millions of downloads, like the top 20 shows, like Tim Ferriss, Jordan Harbinger show. They get those numbers, and they can easily have an agency go get sponsors for them. And that's a model that works for them. And so at that point, they're just scaling. More listeners equals more downloads equals more dollars in their pocket. And for a lot of people, that model doesn't work, because if you're getting about 150 downloads, 150, not 150,000, 150 downloads, rough, give or take, depending what the latest numbers are. But these are numbers that have been shared by Buzzsprout and Libsyn, some of the popular podcast hosts. You're doing better than half of all shows. And so if you're getting up to 1,100, now you're doing better than 80% of all shows. You're in the top 20 percentile. So those are great, because if you think about it, it's the long tail effect of podcasts. Having those many people listening week in and week out is really great for your listeners, because those are dedicated listeners interested in your topic. But you're not going to build a sponsorship model off that, anything that's sustainable. if you get higher, 5,000, 10,000, you can start to look at sites like Gumball.fm is a network where you can go and find people who want to have um, host read ads at at that smaller price point, but still you get to 10,000. There's a marketplace for that. Zvook is another one. ZVOOK. I think they're still around, but Gumball is kind of like the one of the bigger ones. Podcorn is another one. So there's marketplaces where you go. You'll have to connect your stats through a site like Chartable, or I think you're hosting, so they can verify your downloads. So you have to make sure you have the downloads. But the model that I like, and the model that we use at our agency, is really just direct sponsorship dollars, and it's the model that I just outlined that we followed for Vertical Farm Podcast. That's my dog Isla joining us on this conversation. So, um, can you hold on one second? I'm
No
sorry.
worries.
I think there's someone actually at the door.
Oh, good. Oh, good. Okay.
Okay.
How'd you go?
Okay.
Good.
Um, yeah, normally I leave that
Guaranteed to
stuff in.
happen.
Well, normally it's fun because as a on Podcast Junkies, when that happens, I leave all that stuff in because this is the true nature of podcasting. Is like we don't live in a perfect bubble. We're not, Radiotopia. This is not Gimlet. Like we're not, we all like to not saying pretend, but we like to imagine that we're like Alex Bloomberg or
Yeah.
and we're doing like this world class audio. But reality is reality, and I think as podcasters, like we all understand, we're doing the best we can, and we're trying to record the best quality we can. But occasionally, like real life sneaks its way in. So by all means, if you want to leave that in there, that's that's perfectly fine
Okay.
because it's a reminder to, especially for other podcasters, that it's not going to be perfect. And sometimes it's a funny reminder to
Absolutely.
folks because
I really noticed it during COVID because so many people go, "Oh my God, like,
yes,
we've got kids, everyone's in the one house, we're all about to kill each
of
other."
course,
And it's just like, it's cool. Just keep going with it. Like, just keep showing up and turning up.
yeah,
Don't be that, don't let that be the reason for you not releasing an episode. So yeah.
yeah. And yeah, I think what was the last part I was leaving off about the sponsorship? Just the focus. So when I thought about the show, I had sponsorships in mind before I even like came up. Like when I came up with the idea, I was like, I want this to be a sponsorship led show. And so when I talk to clients, a lot of times we produce shows for business owners. So they have programs, they have a mastermind, they have a coaching program, something they're offering. And I want them to be thinking about that from the moment they launch a show. Like you can be the sponsor of your own show. So this episode's brought to you by my coaching program. And then make sure you're taking listeners through that journey. The podcast should be an integral part of your marketing funnel. And I always ask a client, I'm like, what's the one thing you want the listeners to do as a result of having listened to the episode? And so if they're getting value, you want them to say, hey, if you like this content, then you should sign up for like a free 15-minute session with me, sign up for my lead magnet. You want to get them to that email list so you can slow down the conversation and then, continue that relationship with the listener.
Those call to actions are just so important, aren't they? Because otherwise, mentally, your messaging might be way too subtle. If you're not actually having calls to action in your podcast and helping,
Yeah.
as I suppose the calls to action just really acts as signposts as where you want your listener to go next. So incredibly important. Mm.
One of the other things I want folks to think about, listeners to think about, or the listener to think about, is just be conscious about who the show is for. Like, not only is the show is for, who the show is not for. You should be repelling an audience as fast as you attract them. So be as niche as possible. And if you think you've already found a niche topic, go even more niche, because I think people want to be all things for everyone because they think they want to create a show that's for everyone, but it's going to be watered down. And you want to, know that you are passionate about this one specific topic. I've talked to so many different podcasters. There's a couple that podcast just about their love of dinosaurs, and like, that's the whole show. They've got sponsorships. It's amazing. Another one is about knitting. There's another one about, I think, beekeepers have a podcast, and just like it's so fascinating. When people really take their passion and hone in on it, it gives them focus, and it lets them be clear about who they're going to invite on the show and the topics they're going to talk about, and people are going to love you. And that said, you could have the same podcast and give it to five different people on the same topic. By the end of the year, you'll have five different shows because everyone's going to inject their own personality. So just, you know, put as much of your personality in there. If you want to bring your dog, your barking dog, onto the show as part of a regular feature, like do that, because people at the end of the day, and what we discovered during COVID is just we're all human beings here, and we're let's make that human to human connection happen as fast as
Yeah, make it
possible.
real. So if you've got someone who comes to you with your podcasting agency and says, "Oh, okay, my ideal listener, mums and dads, or the ones that gets me all the time, entrepreneurs," and it's like, how do you get them to drill down further? Do you have any like tips to really help them to get more granular in that identifying who their ideal listener is?
A lot of times it happens with just the naming of the show. Like, I mean, I keep coming back to that show that I created, the Vertical Farming Podcast. But when people see the name of a show, it should evoke a feeling for them that this is something I want to listen to. So, um, what I'm working with someone who's helping me on the bookkeeping side, helping her start a show. We're calling the show Accounting for Small Business Owners. It's the least sexiest name you can think of. But when you see it, you're like, oh, that's something that solves a pain point that I have a challenge with. Because when people go into these podcast apps, sometimes they're looking for something they need help with, like, you know, um, recovering from Crohn's disease. That if you've recovered from that disease, like call your podcast app, like because people will come specifically for that. And then the other thing to think about is when you title your podcast episodes, like it's an SEO friendly field. And this is something that, thanks to James Cridlin, I was reminded of on Pod News, but just have these long, like verbose titles in your podcast episodes, because it's an SEO friendly field that's being searched by Google. And so if the name of the episode is something like how I got fired from my job and then recovered from Crohn's disease and then discovered, a new meaning in my life. You're like, oh, like what's that about? Like you're pulling people in, you're telling stories, and you can tell stories, in your titles of your episodes. But you know really think about something. Is this something you want to talk about for a year? Just kind of use that time frame, because it's a slog, a bit of a slog, and it's a challenge getting started with that new show. But is this really a topic that lights you up? Because you have to be the first one that's excited about it, and then your listeners, that passion will come through on your episodes, and then you'll get people excited. But just be niche, be specific, and just play with a lot of different titles. If you've got an audience already, if you've got a Facebook group, if you're pick your social where you're the most active, an email list, and saying, hey, I'm thinking about starting a podcast. You guys have been following me for a while now. These are the 3 or 4 names that I've been tossing around. What do you think? And then they'll give you some feedback. Use the power of your own community to build this, collectively. You don't have to do this in a vacuum. Once you've got the title, then jump into Canva and create that artwork and saying, hey, I've got these 4 different artworks. What do you think? Like, A, B, or C, or D. And now you're starting to build up a buzz about the show. Because rather than waiting for the show's launch, hey, it's launched, there's 5 episodes, go listen. I didn't even know you were starting a podcast. like, don't make things harder for yourself. Get active in groups that are talking about the topic you're going to be talking about, before you start the show. And saying, I'm thinking, do you think it'd be great if I started a podcast about this topic? And then people will tell you, like, yeah, or one already exists. But if you did one about this, just like, use the wisdom of the crowds. Don't make this harder than it has to be, but just, be smart about sourcing information, and getting that crowd feedback, and doing that research early on, so that when you do launch it, you feel like there's some momentum behind it.
Absolutely. And I really love like the power of social media from that perspective. I know I comment on all those like LinkedIn posts. It's which one do you think? And I'm just like, I'm one of those people who, probably pretends I'm the busiest person in the world, but you're always ready to help somebody out. If they ask for, can you give me an idea? Can someone give me some feedback? no one ever says no. So it's a great tool to, as you said, get your message out there nice and early and get people excited or even at least aware of your podcast being launched. Now, Harry, I just want to circle back to when you mentioned before about with the SEO side of things and the importance of the title of your episode. What about from a show notes perspective? Does that come through on an SEO side of things?
Not as much. From what I understand, the description is not a field that's being searched from Google's perspective. And we do full show notes. So when we produce shows for clients, we'll do a summary, we'll do key takeaways, we'll do timestamped key takeaways, any links or resources that are mentioned in the podcast episode, and then we pull out a couple of quotes from the episode. So that becomes like a really full, rich, detailed summary. And the reason I do that and the reason we coach our clients to do that is when I'm thinking about the content we're creating, I want the listener to be focused on the content and not worried about like jotting down something that was interesting. Oh, Danielle just mentioned a website. I should like really jot that down. As much as we'd love to think that everyone is listening to our podcast, sitting down, relaxing in their recliner with a notebook, ready to take copious notes, that's not what's happening. We know as podcasters firsthand that you're probably doing something else. You're probably walking the dog, probably making dinner, you're probably out for a jog, you're probably just in your hammock. And so, what I want the guest to, the host to do is just put the listener at ease and saying, hey, I'm going to be sharing a lot of information here. My guest is going to be sharing a lot of information. Everything will be in the show notes. Don't worry about it. Focus on listening, and that's the reason why we do show notes, because I want them to have a resource to go to. And because they're business owners, a lot of times there's important stuff mentioned in there. And I always want the listener to feel um, assured that if there is something mentioned, that they have the confidence in knowing, like, if I say it's going to be in the show notes, it's going to be in the show notes. Because one of the pet peeves I have is when a podcast host says, it'll be in the show notes, and then I go look and it's not in the show notes.
Yeah, it's a good reminder, isn't it? Yeah. Now, before you mentioned Joe Rogan, whenever I say Joe Rogan's name, I really have to stop and think because I always call him Rogan Josh. It's so stupid. And so I'm just like, okay. So let's talk about authenticity. And with your clients that you coach, is there a balance between being themselves and being appealing to a wider audience, and particularly when you're looking from a sponsorship perspective? So is there such a thing as being too authentic?
I don't think so if you're clear about who your audience is for the podcast. And as a result, um, what sponsors would be interested in working with you. When Joe started the show, he literally just started as on YouTube, and he would interview his comic friends, and for 3 hours. And one of his comedian friends at the time told him, I keep forgetting which one it was, but he said, "What are you doing? These things are 3 hours long. They're just too long. It's ridiculous. You need to cut this down to an hour, and then you need to post it on. No one's going to be watching this." And Joe was like, "No." He's like, I'm enjoying this. I really love this. I really love like these long conversations, and I just want to keep on doing it. And he wasn't thinking about sponsors. He wasn't thinking about like being politically correct. He didn't care if anyone really watched the show. And I think it's he's doing something right, because it's the number one
Absolutely.
podcast. And as much as people are polarized by some of his content, I'm just like, look, he says things, that other people think, and he doesn't really care. And sometimes, he's made mistakes, he's admitted to in the past, but we're not perfect. It's a reminder that we've all like done stupid stuff and said stupid stuff, and anyone who says that they're not is lying. And so he just values going deep on these conversations. And if you're a sponsor, you know what you're signing up for. You know what's in the show. Like if you agree, and now it's obviously through Spotify, because of the deal he's made. But I mean, I really think you should be conscious of like why you're doing the show, and if your intention is to do something because it lights you up, then you should keep doing that. And then, I feel like if it grows into something big, then a sponsor will see the numbers and be like, oh yeah, I want to align with that show. But if you're worried about am I saying the right thing? Should I curse? Should I not curse? Just it just feels like a weird balancing act. So now you have your like front facing personality, and now you have your like your podcast face, and now that you have the way you act behind the scenes. And I don't know about you, Danielle, but I think now, like in this day and age, even with my agency, I've switched and I've moved my messaging. To anyone who's been following me on social is keenly aware of this. Like I'm talking about my spirituality like almost every day, and the people that I'm working with are people that are in the consciousness raising space. They're, people who are talking about this idea of spiritual leadership and just some of these metaphysical concepts that I've been following and studying for like almost 20 years that light me up personally. And I was like, this is who I want to work with. I want to talk with people about like star seeds and ancient civilizations in Egypt and crop circles and like, channeling. Like that's my language, and I can speak that language, and I can help you with the podcast stuff. Like, and so we can work on this together because I want their message out. These healers talk about Reiki, whatever, like all this stuff that I feel like this is where the planet is moving to, an awareness of us ourselves as a conscious and awake being. I like to tell people I'm a soul who decided to incarnate on Earth to live a physical existence, and I signed up for this, right, knowing that I'd forget that I had a bigger purpose in life. And so I just talk about that all the time, and it's going to repel people as fast as it attracts them. But that's fine because I'm not for everyone, and that's how you should think about your
And your
podcast.
energy levels as well. Like when you, like, I really noticed it even just then, like your energy levels when you're talking about things that you're passionate about, it just absolutely shines through. So well done. And I think the
Oh
other thing
yeah.
too is people are probably, with so much like on our screens, our eyes just kind of glaze over when we see like maybe ad agency type sterilized type ads. Like it's a
Yeah.
thing of the past, and people actually want to get real and get genuine to understand the person behind the microphone, in the case of
Yeah.
podcasting. So Harry, tell me about, like, when it comes to people finding their own inner voice, what's been one of your biggest success stories, with someone that you've worked with, and what did that process look like?
I think the one that comes to mind is my own story because for the longest time, Danielle, I would always feel like I needed to ride other people's coattails, or just follow other people's voices. Like if I go far back enough, started with my dad. Like I was like, oh, you got to attend university, you've got to get a 9 to 5 job, and so I did that. I got my job. I had a corporate godfather. He said, I started listening to him, and he's like, oh, you have a 6 figure salary. You now in the top 10% of all income earners. I'm like, oh, this is great. And then I left and I went to go work at a .com, and I was following someone who had an idea to do a portal for Latinos, and I left my paying job and I went to go do that. That didn't pan out. I was following his dream, and then I came back and I started working in corporate again. And then I connected with my half brother who owns a construction company in Atlanta, Georgia. He's like, "You want to come work with me?" I was like, "Well, I can go help him." So I was following other people's voices. I did that for 2 years. You know what they say about working with family, like that didn't pan out. I came back 2 years later with my tail between my legs to go live with my parents at 34. And I was like, what's going on here? Like, how come I'm not finding my own path and finding my own voice? And then I luckily had a ticket to Thailand. Through a friend I had connected with years earlier. I was still looking for a job at the time. My corporate godfather hadn't come up with something for me just yet. So I went to Thailand for New Year's, and my friend picked me up. We went on a kind of scooters, just riding around shirtless. We were going out to check out this waterfall. And at one of these waterfalls, he's like, "Oh, come over here. The view is like really fantastic. You've got to see the view from here." So I said, "Sure." I walked over to where he was, but I stepped into a stream that was between him and I. And when I stepped into the stream, it's just there was a rock, there's stones underneath, and this really smooth stone. So I stepped on it. It was literally like stepping on a block of ice. I went up in the air, both feet in the air, landed on my back, and proceeded to be carried over the waterfall towards the edge of the waterfall. This is happening within seconds, Danielle. And I was like, it's like you take one of those little paper boats and you put them in this stream on the sidewalk, and it goes into this. Like that's how fast, how easily I felt I was just being carried over. In the corner of my eye, there was a boulder on the bank. So instinctually, I just stuck out my left foot, and that stopped me from the going over. And this is in Thailand. Mind you, you're in the Philippines. You know what it's like. You know, it would have been a really bad scene. I'm not sure how long it would take to get medical attention there, but you probably would have died or been in bad shape. My friend is like got eyes that was wide as saucers. He's like shaking. I'm shaking. He gives me his hand up. We managed to make a day out of it, and I enjoy the rest of my trip. But it's funny when I came back, get back to New York, and you don't realize these things in the moment. But I'm just like, what a shame it would have been if I died with my voice
Mm.
inside me. And I was like, oh man, like this awareness that we all have a story. Everyone listening right now to this podcast in this moment has a voice inside of them. And so what I realized is like, wow, podcasting is a platform. Podcast is a vehicle for help to help you find your voice. And that's my mission. I've said that my mission is to help 1 million people find their voice. And now I'm helping people who are the amplifiers get their messages out. So that's the real takeaway. Like if you're listening, you have a story that your intended audience is just waiting to hear from you. They're waiting to hear your story. And you owe it to them to share it, because you never know. It could just be one person listening, Danielle, that hears something today and just like, that's what I needed. That's the one thing. Like when I go on stage and I speak, I just want affect one person, and it's happened. It's just one person comes up. He's like, you know what? I I've been going through some stuff right now. What you just said resonated with me right in this moment. I needed to hear it, and just having that confidence and the sense that you have something valuable to share. It's not up to you to decide, who is the person, or what's the location, or how it's going to be received. It's your obligation to just tell it. Tell it everywhere you can. Tell it whenever you're giving a stage, whenever you're given a platform, whenever you're given a stage, whether it's virtual or in person. Share that story, because there's someone who's going through something similar, and will and that's what they need. That's the piece that they need to help them move forward. And then eventually, I would imagine they're going to pass it on as well.
Yeah, that's look that I think we can often get caught up in vanity metrics, and that for me was just a really good reminder of making sure you're doing it for the right reasons in terms of your podcast. And
Yeah.
I think that's where if we don't really understand that, that's when we can lose momentum and it becomes a little bit hard. And we get probably, you see so many podcasters that are maybe double digits and then it stops. And
Yeah.
very few get to triple digits. So like, what are some of the things that you see that actually is there common themes that stop people in terms of their momentum with finding their voice?
No, I think it's some of the things we've talked about, just being self-conscious. Like, does anyone want to hear this? Is this important? Like, no one will be able to relate to me. I've never told anyone this before. My family doesn't know about this. Like, there's so many different excuses you can come up with. But, we all share a lot of common ground, that we think other people can't relate to my story. And so I think the sooner you align with what your purpose is and what you were meant to do, and you're not going to figure this out right away. So it's a lot of times through a podcast, you can have conversations with people if it's about something that's related to wellness. If you're talking to people who inspire you and help you learn how to be better. If you have anxiety and you want to be better and you can't pay for a therapist, start a podcast like how I fix my anxiety, and you talk to therapists about what they guide their patients through. I mean, I always think my marketing brain's always thinking, but I'm just like, hey, you know, I'd love to hear, what are the things that this helped for you, and then you're getting healed through the process of having the conversation. You're helping your audience heal through the process of this conversation. So, just have be this is where it comes back to the passion, whether it's something that lights up a fire inside of you, or it's a cause you really want to get out to the world. I think just be consistent, because I think when you peter out, it's probably because it wasn't anything that you were interested in, or you're just creating a Me Too podcast. Like you saw someone do that. This was funny with John Lee Dumas. He started Entrepreneur on Fire. There was a whole wave of podcasts for like a year and a half that were like dentists on fire and therapists on fire and veterinarians on fire. It was just like so ridiculously copying what he did. He just managed to start podcasting in the right moment where that made sense. And they try to do a daily podcast. And I'm like, No, you're going to realize how hard it was. So just carve out your own path, and do something that you're passionate about. And I think that's what's going to keep you going through the challenging times, through the times you don't feel like recording. I know when I see an invite to speak on a show like today, or I see someone that's scheduled on Podcast Junkies and Vertical Farming Podcast, I see that invite on my calendar and I get excited. Like I'm happy. Like, oh, this is great. I'm going to be talking to this person. I'm going to learn something, or I'm going to connect with a friend. Because Podcast Junkies is now my connection with old podcasting friends. Because I see them in the conference and I'm like, can we chat later? I mean, you just see each other in passing. I'm like, let's come on the show. So they come on, and we haven't spoken in like 3 or 4 years, but I'm just like, it's just us talking. It's almost like there's no one else, that's there except the listener. And I just value that time, that ability to continue to make those connections. And that's really the magic of podcasting, to build those lifelong
Well,
relationships.
Harry, I've got to say, I'm not surprised that your podcasting with Podcast Junkies has done so well, because I just feel like, exactly the same thing today. Like, we were just having this one-on-one conversation, and I know by no means am I a podcast expert, but having the likes of you on today has really helped me, and I'm sure it's helped our listeners too. So I'm really grateful for your time. So thank you so much. In terms of our listeners and wanting to connect with you and continue the conversation, how are they best to get in contact?
So the best place to go is, I'm fairly active on social. So on LinkedIn, you can just look for Harry Duran, Harry Duran FC on Twitter, and on Instagram. Mostly active on Twitter. I sort of like, almost like the way podcasting is a bit anonymous when you're behind the mic. I sort of like the text only option of Twitter, so that's why I tend to just stream of consciousness, talk about things. The website, the agency website is fullcast.co. If folks are learning a little bit more about that, and then yeah, pretty much any combination of those will take you down some rabbit holes if you want to learn more about what I'm
Absolutely.
up to. Please
Harry,
do.
thank you so much for being on the show. I genuinely appreciate your time today, and also the learnings. I've written a lot of notes actually, for myself, so I really appreciate it.
Well, thank you, Danielle, for the opportunity to allowing me to share my story, and I applaud you for what you're doing, because I think people think, it's a podcast about podcasting. Like, how many of these more do we need? But I think with the influx of people learning about podcasting, every single opportunity they have, that they may be discovering podcasting through this show, and these conversations that you're having is just a reminder that there's no one way to produce a podcast, and there's no one right show. And I think listening to the variety of voices on this show will demonstrate to them, and give them the confidence that maybe this is something that's worth their time to
Excellent.
try.
Thanks so much, Harry. Appreciate it.